Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Burrett. Welcome to the A Different Kind of Psychiatry case presentation webinar. We're glad to have you. Some of our audience members have enjoyed the doctor's interactions so much, we've decided to do something different. Today's webinar will be in an interview format. If you have any questions, we'll take questions from the audience after the discussion. I'm happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ed Chastka, and his presentation, Therapy Helps a Boy Grow Up. Dr. Chastka is board certified in medical ergonomy and general psychiatry. He's in private practice in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania. Dr. Chastka.
Thank you, Dr. Burr. So the patient that I'd like to present to you and to our audience today is a young man his mom brought him to see me right at the end of his junior year of high school. And she brought him because he was starting to have trouble in school. His grades were deteriorating. He was procrastinating, getting up late, getting to school late, missing classes, staying up late at night playing video games on his iPhone. And this was entirely out of character for Walter. Previously, he'd been a pretty good student.
And so, Dr. Chastka, tell us, did Walter call you for treatment? Did his mother? How did it start?
Well, it started with his mom reaching out to me, and she called. Her concern was Walter had been in treatment for a long time he was diagnosed with some developmental delays and with ADHD. And he'd done actually quite well at overcoming these problems. But her concern was that this was somehow an worsening of his ADHD.
I see. And you said he had developmental delays? What do you mean?
Yeah, well, I met with his mom first to get the background. And what she told me is it had been a very difficult birth. He'd been got stuck in the birth canal on the way out, and he was starting to have what they call deceleration, heart rate first going up and then starting to drop, low oxygen. And the obstetrician came to his mom and said, you have to get him out or we're going to have to do a emergency C-section. So his mom was determined, and she bore down as hard as she could, and she got him out, but he was blue, and it took him a long time to get his breathing going and to pink up. But he did come around. He had some developmental delay, though. He didn't speak until he was 5. He had to have speech therapy. His fine motor skills were delayed. He had to have physical therapy. He was diagnosed with ADHD in kindergarten and started on some medications that helped. And he had actually progressed very well to the point where in high school, he was almost entirely mainstreamed and his grades were good. He was mostly A/B student. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't taking advanced placement courses, but he was doing well.
Dr. Chastka, when you say mainstream, you mean in regular education, not in special education anymore?
Right. He started out with what they call an IEP, a special program where he was getting special help in his classes, often would be in a separate room so he wasn't distracted. But by his 10th year, sophomore year in high school, he was, except for he had a counselor he could go to when he was struggling. Other than that, he was taking mainstream classes and doing quite well.
Wow. And now you mentioned his mother brought you to him, and what did he want out of treatment? Did he even want to see you?
Well, this was an interesting thing because a lot of kids that age, they don't want anything to do with therapy. They want to be just like their friends, and they think none of their friends have problems. It's not true, but Walter was not that way. He wanted treatment. The problem is that he and his mom didn't see eye to eye on what the problem was. And I was to find out later on, this was a lifelong problem of those two butting heads. But mom thought that it was his ADHD worsening and that he needed a new medication. But Walter's idea was entirely different. He said, my problem is anxiety. And when I first asked him what that felt like, and he couldn't even describe it to me. What he started to talk about were these things that were going on in his head. And what was happening in his head is he was having these violent, intrusive thoughts. He would, when he walked down the street, if he passed a man, he would be afraid that he was going to assault them. Or if he passed a woman, he would be afraid that he was going to rape them. Now, this was so out of character that it was almost laughable. Walter was not a violent person at all, and of course he found these intrusive thoughts offensive and painful. But that's what was bothering him. And of course, if you have these kind of things going on in your mind, it's very difficult to concentrate in school. So it looked like his ADHD was worse to his mom. What was really going on was a new thing, which was anxiety and these intrusive thoughts that were sometimes violent.
Dr. Chastka, you mentioned all this in his mind. Are you saying he was connected with the thoughts, but he wasn't describing to you a racing heart? He wasn't describing this uneasiness in his body? Is that what you mean?
He couldn't describe his physical state very well. And that's not unusual. A lot of people are really out of touch with themselves emotionally. But that was a particular feature that I noticed quite early on, is that he really needed help just understanding what his feelings were, getting in touch with them and describing them. And so that was one thing I started out right from the beginning, is getting him in touch with his feelings.
I see.
Just by describe them.
Before we go on with his story, when you say ADHD, I think some people have an idea of what that means. How do you look at ADHD?
Well, ADHD in the traditional psychiatry is diagnosed on a set of behaviors. Usually it's problems with attention, concentration, behavioral problems, either fidgetiness or impulsivity. So in traditional psychiatry, this is diagnosed based on surface observations of a child. And it's a legitimate syndrome. There are lots of children that struggle with this. But in orgonomy, we understand that these symptoms are caused by internal conflict. Armoring, what we call armoring. People have emotional conflicts growing up, and they react to them in different ways. And one of them is, one way kids react to emotional stress is to go off. If your environment is painful, then if you go off in your mind someplace, it can avoid the pain, at least temporarily. Another thing you see with the more hyperactive types is it's almost like a wall of noise and activity around them. You can't make contact because they're always moving and fidgeting, and they never really connect to you. So ADHD is a syndrome in traditional psychiatry that medical ergonomists understand as having an underlying emotional basis.
I see. Thank you for that. So with Walter, he had these intrusive, painful thoughts, and his mother saw him as daydreaming or inattentive. And so she wanted medicine adjustment. And how did you handle that when they first came to you with two different problems?
Well, Walter's mom was an interesting person. Uh, when I first walked out to the waiting room, she seemed kind of meek and mild. I brought her in first to talk to her, and once I started talking to her, I realized she was anything but. She was kind of a bulldozer, and she knew what she thought, and she knew what she wanted, and she kind of saw me as an extension that she and Walter had gotten into this very antagonistic relationship, and her view seemed to be that my job was to get Walter to listen to her and do what she said. So what she wanted me to do was to stop the current medicine and put him on a different medicine. And in fact, she was so sure of herself that she'd already started taking him off the medicine before she even came into the office. And she didn't consult the old psychiatrist that Walter had been seeing or me. She had him tapering off of this medicine.
She takes charge, it sounds like.
She was taking charge. Now, that was her character. Walter's character was to resist. So
Dr. Chastka, how old was Walter at this point when he came to you for therapy?
He was 17. So he was a junior. He was just completing his junior year and heading into his senior year.
I see.
But he'd been in treatment for a long time, but he hadn't really had any, but mostly medication for ADHD and the physical therapy and the speech therapy.
Can you describe what does he look like? What does he like to be with?
Walter he comes across as kind of a shy guy, a little bit embarrassed. He's tall, he's a little bit gangly. He kind of comes into the room a little bit hunched over, and he's got this smile that's kind of embarrassed, sheepish smile. Like, oh, did I do something wrong? Oh, I just messed up. And that was his attitude. He was kind of meek. He was mild, but that was just the surface. Underneath, there was this really stubborn guy, and he'd been involved in this conflict with his mother since early childhood. She ran the show, and she wanted to tell him what to do, and then Walter had fought back by becoming very stubborn and negative, and he had kind of shut down, and his life was a big no. And this came out in the history that this procrastination in the morning, he would spend hours on his cell phone playing video games, but then he couldn't get up for school in the morning. He couldn't get his assignments done. He couldn't get his chores around the house done. So it was really a big no. His mom wanted to do this, that, and the other. And underneath it, now Walter is always careful to point out to me that it's, I'm not choosing to do this, but underneath with this stubborn emotional no. And it was coming out with his mom, also with his maternal grandfather. You see, Walter's problems hadn't ended with the early birth problems. His father had left the family when Walter was about 5. So,
Dr. Chastka, I'm glad you mentioned that. Somebody in the audience was curious to hear, where was his father in all of this?
Well, it was an interesting thing because his father left the family when Walter was about 5. So Walter was still going through speech problems, physical therapy problems, and the father left the home. Now, his father only lived about a half hour away. His father lived near his own family, Walter's paternal grandparents and an uncle, and they all lived about a half hour away. And Walter told me that he saw his father frequently. But the interesting thing was that I never could get a feeling for who his father was or what their relationship was like. And it wasn't because I didn't try. I would ask him. It was like his father was a ghost in his life. Even though I know he was there, he would go to the house, he would spend time with his father, but he wasn't an authoritative presence in his life. The most authoritative presence in his life, besides his mother, was his maternal grandfather.
I see.
And the maternal grandfather was like the mother was, somebody who liked to be in charge. He liked to have things done his way. And Walter had begun to develop an antagonistic relationship with him too. So whereas his grandfather just said, just get it done, patch it together. And Walter went the total opposite way. He was, let's do things by the book, let's do things carefully, we'll always do our maintenance first. Walter's father was up at the crack of dawn. Walter never really got moving until early afternoon because of all the procrastination. So you can see that this holding back and the stubbornness had developed in contrast and in conflict with the mother and maternal grandfather who wanted to run the show and tell him how to do things. And at the same time, there's this ghost of a father who's there but not.
That brings up a few questions in my mind. One, sometimes we talk about someone's nature and someone's character. Do you have a sense for Walter? Is his character slow and methodical, or is that just part of his stubbornness, or both?
Well, I think that stubbornness is part of the character. That's the way he is. He's obsessive. Everything has to be done by the book. He takes his time, but unfortunately to the point where he doesn't get started to sometimes mid-afternoon. Mm-hmm. He doesn't get things done. So it's a character trait. And of course, being careful and methodical can be a very good thing if it's not done to excess. But in Walter, it had begun to take over his life. So that oppositional kind of stubborn negativity also began to emerge in my relationship with him as time went on. So one of the things I remember feeling with Walter is this strong hunger for a father figure in his life, for somebody connected to him emotionally, a father hunger. And he really wanted it, but the character that was from the depth. That's what he needed. And the character was in the way. So he reacted by becoming stubborn, resisting, negative.
Do you have any sense, you said you asked many times about his relationship with his father, and it was never quite clear from him what was happening. Is that part of Walter and his feelings about his relationship that maybe interferes with you even being able to talk about it in any kind of meaningful way, or is it something else? What's your sense?
Well, I think so. It's hard to say. It's hard to say much about a ghost, but that's the way it was. Like his father was never a real presence in his life. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't really know what it was like. So in part, our relationship became fatherly. Mm. He came to me for advice and support. Now, initially, that was a lot in his struggle with his mother.
Dr. Chastka, I'm just thinking, when he told you about those intrusive thoughts, did that come freely, or did you have to really encourage him to say that?
Didn't take much, and that's an interesting point, because a lot of people are very ashamed of those things. And it's you have to draw them out over a period of time. But he actually came out with that right in the first session. Now, I think that was because it was ammunition to use to fight his mom. So mom says, I have ADHD and need another ADHD medicine. I say I have anxiety and these thoughts and need something else.
Yeah, it sounds like it's that hunger too, because I agree with you. There's sometimes, I'm seeing someone for 3 years now and I'm learning something new that I had no clue about, and he comes to you with something so deep. When you said the word hunger, I almost could feel him like hungry to actually connect with you about, these deeper feelings and thoughts that he has.
Yeah. Yeah. The hunger was there, but also the fear of it,
Yeah.
and the fear drives the stubbornness and the resistance. Because Walter was a master at frustrating people.
I see.
You could feel the hunger for a connection underneath, but underneath, he knew how to drive people crazy with this procrastination and being slow about things and holding back. And the other thing he would do was he loved to get into debates. He was very much up in his head,
Uh-huh.
and he loved to get in debates. And that had started with his mom. You see, they were always arguing, and it went beyond debate with them. They started screaming at each other. So in beginning of the therapy, I had to walk this line, because I was at that point I was working with sometime with mom and sometimes with Walter, and mom wanted me to be her, her disciplinarian and make Walter do what she wanted. And Walter took everything I said and used it as ammunition to throw it at his mom. Well, Dr. Chastka said that I, and it was difficult for a while.
And what did the mother have to say about that?
Well, she used to call me and tell me, what she thought I was doing wrong, and she would send her list of demands, and I would listen. You have to understand that the mom was partly right. I mean, she was anxious for her son. She knew that he had problems. She knew that he needed her support. He wasn't able to function on his own, and yet she didn't know how to keep things from turning into a battle.
Mm.
Because she knew what was right, and if in her mind, if Walter just listened to her, everything be fine. And there was an element of truth to that. A lot of what mom said was correct, but that for Walter to have given into it would have been giving up himself and his independence and his own growth. So it was it was a disease, his stubbornness and his holding back, but it was a disease that on a deeper level had health in it. Was that he was fighting for his life and his independence and his selfness, his self-determination.
You know, what strikes me is there's quite a few young men and women at, age 16, 17, 18 that I've worked with. And I think what I hear you saying with his mother is that she understands some of the practical things that could help or that may need to be done, but is missing that emotional aspect of what's interfering with him doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
We often talk about that analogy of a log jam, and she's, trying to push harder into that log jam, and you're there trying to help clear the way, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, that conflict went on for till the end of high school, really. And then it was decided, the whole family decided that Walter was going to go to college. And he'd worked as a landscaper during high school, done very well under the direction of a very understanding, kind man who ran the company.
Hmm.
But as soon as Walter got off to college, things went bad quickly. His procrastination worsened. He wasn't going to class. He wasn't getting his assignments done. And
Did he want to go? Did he want to go to college?
he said he did. Um, I'm not sure that he was ready.
Mhm.
I didn't say that to him or the family because I wasn't sure that at that point that it wouldn't have worked. I could see the need for him to get away and establish his independence. And I thought if it worked, it would have been a great thing.
Yeah.
But unfortunately didn't. And he came home, feeling like a failure and went into a pretty severe depression. And things worsened at home with his mom. And it was quite a while till he could get back on his feet.
Mm. And what was working with him like then? I mean, was it a challenge to help motivate him to get him up off his feet again? What was he?
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of a dark winter.
Mm.
His father's family found him a job that he was totally unsuited to. It was a night shift job, and he had so much problems with time management anyway. And to his credit, he hung with it for a couple of months, but then quit, and then of course felt like a failure again, and a couple of other desultory attempts at working that just didn't work. And then finally his mom came up with the idea that she was going to move him into an apartment on his own. Their conflict had escalated to the point that they'd actually gotten physical with each other a couple of times. And she decided that even though he wasn't working, she was going to move him into an apartment and she was going to pay for it. And that's not a solution that I usually like, because it's kind of a pretend independence. You're living independently, but you're not supporting yourself.
Dr. Chastka, it sounds like in this case, though, with him having a hard time just doing sometimes the basics, that maybe that was enough for him,
That's the way it turned out.
Huh.
It actually turned out pretty well. And it took months. He was doing that, and he got on with the DoorDash, and that kind of worked with him because he wouldn't get up until mid-afternoon, and then he'd have to, do this and that. But by dinner time, he could get moving. So he was earning a little bit of money with that. But gradually he developed some confidence in himself, and it relieved the conflict with his mom. They were out of each other's hair, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And his mom learned to leave him alone. She used to come over and, tell him to clean up and stuff like that. But gradually she backed off. And
how did you manage to keep her? I mean, she sounded very pushy at first. How did you manage to gain her cooperation in working with Walter? How did you maintain that?
I'm not sure that I ever did. I listened to her. I understood where she was coming from. I didn't allow myself to be used as her disciplinarian. And about this time when she was moving in, I got a letter from her, and it says, "This will be my last letter. You will not hear any more from me unless Walter is suicidal." And she listed all the things that she saw that needed to be done with Walter, and all the things she thought I was doing wrong, and all the ways that she was right. And she said that that's the last communication there was going to be, unless he became suicidal, and then she would call me. And I think that, even though, there were some problematic parts of that, I think that was the right thing. It was her bowing out. She was saying, okay, I'm going to help him financially, but for the rest, I'm bowing out. And it worked.
It was the way that family allowed him to be independent, with throwing their hands up in the air rather than saying, here you go.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And, he did the DoorDash thing for a while, and therapy became very uneven at that point. He didn't come very often. I talked to him a lot on the phone. He'd call me once or even twice a week, but he couldn't come in. I gave him a discounted fee, but he still couldn't afford it, and he was embarrassed to ask his mom for the money. So I'd only see him once in a while, although, like I say, we've stayed in touch on the phone. But he gradually started to do things where, he'd started to learn to get his laundry done and do the things he had to do. And then one day I got a call from him and he said, "I got an interview." I said, "Oh, great. That's wonderful." And he
For a job? What interview for what?
What's that?
An interview for what?
Well, he had an interview for a job with a local grocery store. And it was close enough for him to walk. And they seemed to be a kind of supportive environment. He was reluctant, he was frightened, but they took to him, and they liked him and they brought him along slowly. He couldn't commit to working they offered him a full-time job, but he couldn't commit. So he started out hourly, and they just gradually brought him along. And it wasn't that long until he was working full-time, unofficially, he's still part-time. But he was working pretty much full-time, and it really did wonders for his self-esteem.
Yeah,
I still had to struggle to get up in the morning, but he was doing it. But he started to feel good about himself.
And rightly so. Yeah. I mean, that's coming a long way.
He came a long way. Yeah.
Dr. Chastka, I'm curious, and some of the audience members are curious, what is it that you see that his therapy helped him? How did you connect with him that you think was able to kind of bolster him and get him through these difficult times and deal with his anxiety? How did you help him?
Well, first thing I did is be supportive with him. He needed somebody in his corner.
Yeah.
So I was in his corner and supported him and tried to help him understand how to relate to his family and not turn things antagonistic, get control of his temper, to recognize his contributions, to recognize his procrastination, to recognize his negativity. And he was really quite insightful. He would get it all. And that part was helpful to him to get perspective about what was going on. He began to understand that, there's me inside and then there's this disease I have. So began to separate him from his armoring and for him to see it as something foreign and something he could address. But the therapy really started taking a step forward when I started to notice this kind of just slight smile that he had every time he would start talking to me. So he would come in and he'd start talking about this problem or that problem, how he's stuck in his head. He gets caught with, he doubts his own feelings, he doubts his decisions, his conflicts, and he'd draw me into this world of ruminative thinking that just went around and around and around. And then once he had me good and in there, I'd see this slight smile on the corners of his mouth. And I thought, he's got me. He's drawn me into this thinking. His thinking is his defense against feeling. And drawing me into his thinking was his defense against therapy. So I started pointing out the smile. And the interesting thing is when I would talk to him about his rumination or his stubbornness or his negativity, it would just turn into this conversation. But when I pointed out the smile, it just stopped him dead. You could see for a minute he would start to feel. And then he'd get embarrassed about it and he'd go back to talking, but consistently pointing out the smile brought him in touch with the fact that this ruminative kind of thinking that he would draw people into was his defense against the feelings in himself and against an emotional connection with other people. So when I started to point that out to him and to point out the defensive function of the thinking and the defensive function of the talking, he began to feel more. And I think that was crucial to his improvement.
You mentioned getting kind of sucked into his ruminative thinking. Is that also a way that he can help people know how he's doing without being able to say it in another way of, it sounds frustrating to be stuck in that ruminative thinking. And you talked about how he can frustrate people. Is that a way he communicates how frustrated he is, by bringing you into it and saying, this is what I deal with all the time? Is there something to that?
That's a good point. I never thought of that. I always felt like it was his way of winning, because the smile had this slight winning, like I'm winning.
Yeah.
And I think it was his way, of winning an argument. He kind of saw everything in terms of he had to argue to get his way. And that's the way it was with his mom and with his grandfather. So when he drew you into the argument, he was winning.
Yeah.
But of course, winning in character means losing in therapy, because you're not reaching the deeper emotions.
You say he saw everything as a conflict. Do you think also that's part of his, is that part of his nature? Or is that part of just the character he developed? And I'm wondering now, you kind of described him as kind of a shy, embarrassed, but nice guy, I wonder if that's something to it also, that he's constantly being brought into conflict, and that's probably the last thing he wants. I mean, kind of like these intrusive, aggressive thoughts.
Yeah. The way that kind of nice, embarrassed guy was on the surface, and underneath was the kind of stubborn, provocative, but provocative in a very passive sense. And then underneath was that, in the core was that deep longing for a connection with people and with life. So
what was there a most moving moment in therapy with him? Was there anything that stood out in working with him?
He had been working at the grocery store for about 6 months when he began to talk to me about this girl who worked in the pharmacy. And he would describe their interactions to me, and clearly she was interested. And then I remember but he was afraid to go beyond just some talking pleasantries with her. And I remember then one day he came in and he said, she doesn't seem interested in me anymore. And I said to him, well, what makes you think that? And he said, well, she doesn't smile at me as much or anything. I said, how do you know until you go up and ask her? How do you know if she's interested? Why don't you just go up and ask her if she'd like to go out for coffee sometime? And he got up his nerve and he did it. And lo and behold, she said yes.
Wow.
And they started dating. And it wasn't too long ago he came in, and he was a different guy that day. It was just like he was so expanded and happy and everything. And they're now official. He's got a girlfriend. He's got a job and a girlfriend.
Wow.
Yeah. And at work, they offered him a management trainee position. That's how much they like him. So.
So kind of his initial complaints of intrusive thoughts, difficulty with getting out of bed, I mean, have they improved? Are they still there? How have things progressed?
That's interesting. They just haven't been an issue. Once he got involved in life and started facing the anxiety and facing his frustration, these intrusive thoughts just seem to fade away.
Wow.
They haven't been an issue in years.
So it wasn't that there was any specific intervention that addressed them, but kind of as he made his way into the world with your support, they faded. Is that accurate?
You took the energy away from him.
Uh,
The energy was pulled up in his head, thinking, and he started to get down into his body and start to do things in life, and it just took the energy away from these kind of intrusive thoughts.
I see. And so I think some of our audience have an idea of, traditional talk therapy. Some may have an idea of how medical ergonomists do therapy differently, whether that means breathing, kicking, different interventions like that. What was it that helped Walter? Did you do any interventions like that?
I do work with his eyes a lot, having him follow a pen light, and that's been very helpful. And other than that, mostly the character work on the ruminative thinking. I think at some point he will be ready to. There's a lot of anger underneath that we haven't gotten to yet.
I see.
And that's got to come out before he can really function. I did try having him lie on the couch and kick and shout, but he just couldn't tolerate it. So that was premature. And when the time comes, we'll do that. But right now, just activating the eyes, because there's with these kind of thinking and perceptual problems. And he has the ruminative thinking, but he also has doubting. He doubts his perception. He gets caught in severe ambivalence. He can't make a decision. And those things always involve the eyes. So when you have a person move the eyes and make contact with a light or with you, it helps loosen that up. And that's been very helpful with it.
Like you said before, even with your character work and talk therapy, helping him gain perspective and make sense of his perceptions and feel confident in them. Is that?
Yes, that's right. That's working on the eyes.
Yeah.
Getting perspective on your life and on your illness.
Yeah. Let me see what questions the audience have. Someone asked, what's your sense of how Walter feels about you as therapy has progressed? I mean, or does he have positive feelings, negative feelings? We kind of talked about that father hunger, and obviously, if you look at someone as a father figure, there can be negative, there can be positive. Mm-hmm. How does he see you? What's your sense?
Well, I think he does have that connection with me underneath, but he's still really afraid to have it. So he keeps me at a distance with the talking, the ruminations. But more and more, that's beginning to soften up. Mm-hmm. He begins to see what its function is in life, which is to keep him from connecting to himself and also to keep him from connecting to me and to the world. So it's beginning to soften, but there's still that wall between us.
Mm. I'm thinking about, again, how hungry he is for that connection, but it sounds like you're aware of that, but you can't rush it either. You have to do it at his pace and follow him along. And, your patience with letting him kind of see how college works out, taking time with therapy is, again, it's his independence. It sounds like is him leading the way.
Yeah, that's right. That's so true. It's it's like a plant, you know, you can give it good soil and you give it water and you give it sun, but it's got to grow on its own.
Yeah. Does he still take medication?
He does. Yeah. We got him off of the ADHD medicine, and I gave him some medicine for obsessive anxiety.
Uh-huh.
And the interesting thing is, he never takes it regularly. You know, it becomes part of the. He'll take it for a little while. It'll help his anxiety get under control. It'll get worse. He'll stop taking it. You know, of course, I don't do it on purpose. I just can't remember. But he's on and off with that. And my attitude is, you know, I'm not pushing him to take medicine. I'm happy if he can tolerate life without medicine. I'm delighted. If he needs that when the anxiety gets overwhelming, then take it.
Yeah, no, I like that perspective because, you know, medicines are a tool. They're not, you know, it's not good or bad, or it sounds like you're aware of when he needs, and he's aware, actually, most importantly, of maybe when he needs it and when he doesn't. And as long as you guys are on the same page, that sounds like it works well.
It keeps a lid on his anxiety when he needs it, but medicine can't make you happy. You know, life makes you happy. Being in love makes you happy. Finding work you like to do makes you happy. Medicine never make you happy.
Yeah.
Control symptoms won't make you happy.
An audience member asked, what is Walter's goal in therapy now? Has that been discussed or explicit, made explicit by him, as far as how it was when he first met you and how it is now? What's your sense of what he's looking for?
Well, the real growth there has been going from blaming everybody else. So when he was at home, it was always, you know, mom, grandpa, everybody's against me. You know, it's, you know, if they just get off my back, everything be fine. But of course, if they got off his back, then he just spent his life up in his room on his phone.
Mm-hmm.
With moving out and starting to be independent now, he doesn't spend as much time blaming, and he's starting to look more at himself and say, oh, you know, and fortunately he now has the perspective that this is my disease. It's not me, but this is the problem. It's in me now. I have to work on this chronic, you know, what he's working on right now is the chronic overthinking that keeps him from just moving and enjoying life. So he has gradually over the course of therapy switched from how do I deal with mom to how do I deal with this disease that I have.
Again, getting perspective on what he needs to be putting his aggression into.
Yes, that's right.
I like that. Someone asked, you know, you mentioned he had a very difficult birth. Do you have a sense of how much that contributed versus just his interactions with his mother, and her antagonism and pushiness, you know, throughout life?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that, you know, he was way behind in development, and you can still see signs of it. I mean, he's not 100% caught up. He's still, you know, a little bit awkward physically, but I would say he's done remarkably well. You know, life finds a way, you know, and he found a way around all these disabilities, and you know, he's living a pretty normal life.
Yeah, you know, I'm thinking it's you talk about that stubbornness with his mother or other people, or even just the day, you know, get up, don't get up. And he sounds dogged, I guess would be a way to describe him. Like he's just going to keep going. And he has, you know, he started life with this uphill battle and he's still chugging along.
Yes, he has determination.
Yeah.
He doesn't move fast, but he doesn't quit.
Yeah. Oh, that gives me chills to hear. Yeah. Dr. Chastka, this has been wonderful. This has been a wonderful discussion. It's been fun talking with you and hearing the case kind of develop through these questions. Um, I don't know what else to say. It's just been kind of interesting to do it this way. And it sounds like you're doing wonderful work with Walter. How old is he now?
Oh boy, let's see. I guess I've seen him for about 5 years now. So probably, no, probably 6 years. So probably 23.
Wow.
Yeah.
So maybe we can have another webinar in 5 or 6 years and in the next stage.
And he'll be the head of the company, married and the head of the company.
Yeah.
Married and a manager.
Yeah. Well, why don't we stop there? This has been a great discussion. Dr. Chastka, thank you very much for presenting your patient.
Well, thank you. It was really great having you, and thanks for stepping in and doing this.
Sure. And to the audience, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful. Thank you for the questions. I hope you like this new format. We'll probably try this format out a few times, maybe go back to the other one, depending on the case. But thank you for joining us very much. And a special thank you to our donors who make the work at the ACO possible. Our next webinar is Saturday, April 17th, and it's at 4 p.m. And Dr. Sal Iacobello is presenting his case, A College Student Faces Depression in the Age of Social Distancing. I think it'll be a good one, so I hope to see you there. And in the meantime, I hope you listen to our podcast, the A Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast. See you next time.